TE Talks with Guides is a weekly podcast for lovers of history, travel, and all things Italian. Thank you. Welcome back, everybody, to TE Talks, sponsored by Through Eternity Tours. I'm your host, Rob Allen, and on TE Talks, we get to talk with some of the most fascinating people who make a living out of being wonderful stories. Today, we have Emily joining us, who will be discussing one of everyone's favorite subject, who especially comes to Italy, is Michelangelo and the David. Ciao, Emily.
Hello, Rob. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it is a great pleasure. You're looking fabulous as usual.
Oh, well, thank you.
And how are things going with you? Motherhood is looks lovely on you.
Thank you. It's going well. You know, the silver lining for me for this pandemic has been spending so much time with the baby at home. But I'm ready to get back to work.
Yes, I'm amazed. I mean, you have these beautiful, glorious golden locks going through, and your son Jack does not try to grab at your hair at all, because usually
he does.
Mothers. Oh, he does.
Oh, he does. My hair is never down. This is a very special occasion.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Now, before we get into our subject, I just would like to ask our listeners, if you guys enjoy the podcast, please rate us. Sign on to the podcast so you know whenever we have a new one coming up. But do rate us with 5 stars, because that's very, very helpful. 4 stars doesn't help us, but 5 stars does. And also, if you can send a review, because all of that will let other people know about what we do. So, Michelangelo. Everyone who comes to Italy, it doesn't even depend where they go. Somewhere that name is going to be coming up. So we're going to talk about him. And of course, you're one of our wonderful guides in Florence, and this is his birthplace. I guess you could say he's really situated in Florence, and then, of course, Rome. I was getting into a little spat last week when I did my podcast with Angelo, because he was saying, well, Florence is the be-all and end-all of everything. And I was like, wait, one hot minute here. Let's talk about Rome. So maybe we'll do that again. It was quite enjoyable. But tell me about what you think about Michelangelo. And, of course, I know your passion is, especially because you've done an incredible virtual tour about the David by Michelangelo. So let's delve into it.
Yeah, my obsession, we could say, I don't know if it's a healthy obsession or not, but my obsession really is with the David in particular. I know so many of my colleagues, so many of my guide friends say, oh, to do the Academia again today, to do the David again today, doing the David twice. And I'm like, I'll go in there 4 times a day. I'm good. I'll go say hi to my man. Wow. And there's a reason why pre-pandemic you had over 1.5 million visitors into the Academia Gallery every year. In 2019, I think it was 1.6 or 1.7 million.
My God. And
when you really put it into perspective, that most of those people are going in there just to see the David, sure, one work of art, it's a big deal. So all this to say, I don't think I'm the only one who's obsessed with David as the rest of humanity out there.
I think so. I mean, arguably, the David is the most famous statue of modern times, if not all time, right? I mean, there's some couple ancient classic statues, of course, that we could say, wait, hold on a second. But, I think, of course, because his image is projected everywhere on aprons that men like to wear sometimes, it's just his photographs, posters, magnets. But there is a thing. I remember once, a very, very long time ago, before I even became a guide, I was a tour director for students. And this girl was very upset. She said, why did I have to pay a ticket to see the David when there's a copy right outside here? Yeah. And of course, I was just going, because for me, I want to say, well, because the soul of the artist who's had his hands, blood, sweat, and tears working on that piece is in that piece. I mean, and especially with Michelangelo pieces. I mean, I have never been moved to tears by statues unless I've seen works by Michelangelo, not for the David, but for the Pietas. That's when I really was moved. The David was stunning. It was astounding for me. But, the Pietà, the one he did when he was 24, I've spoken about this before. Even though it was surrounded by 200 people back in 1996, when I saw it for the first time, it just shot right to me. It was amazing.
I mean, we're going to have to change the subject matter because I change the subject. You tell I've been in art history world. Change the subject matter. Change the subject because I even when I am in a classroom teaching with a PowerPoint, Michelangelo's Pietà in St. Peter's, I can't. I start crying immediately. I always have to tell my students, you're going to feel really awkward because I will be crying in front of you. And actually yesterday I was in the Museo dell'Opera del Duomo here in Firenze, in Florence, looking at the Bandini Pietà, the unfinished sculpture by Michelangelo. And it's just the way that the Virgin Mary's face is pushed up against her son's, almost as if she is smelling his hair for the very last time. And it's completely unfinished, and it's just that emotional quality that Michelangelo is able to convey to us. We feel it. You feel it deep in your soul. And that's why Michelangelo is so incredible. That's what it is for me. It's the way that he makes us feel. We can all connect with that feeling, but more so than that, we feel it to ourselves. And that's what gets me. And it's the same with David. But going back to what you were saying before, I have so many people always tell me, well, why is the David so famous? Like a lot of well, I get a lot of students, but in my few years of teaching undergrad,
we're going to start talking with Kim Kardashian accents.
I gotta be careful.
So great.
But why is the David so famous? I get that question all the time. And it's different than, say, the Mona Lisa, who wasn't so famous up until, the late 20th century, where when Jackie O went to visit her, she was stolen, and she becomes this whole kind of, she, as in the Mona Lisa, becomes a whole kind of piece of contemporary culture, really, the late
enigmatic.
Yeah. The David was always that famous. And that's the difference. He was always that famous. From when he was finished in 1504, as Vasari writes, he was the greatest sculpture ever made, better than any of the ancients, he says, Vasari says, better than any contemporaries. And I always, give this wording. I hope none of you want to be sculptors, because apparently in the 1500s, it was already said that no other sculpture will be as great as the David. Of course, that's, we can chat about that. But in my opinion...
Yeah, remember Michelangelo didn't always have the strongest opinion of Vasari himself, right?
Yeah. Oh, of course. Rewriting his own biography with Ascanio Condivi just to set the message.
Definitely. Yeah. Well, just to add the famous anecdote, because Vasari is, he's really the most famous. I mean, I don't think people know a lot about him. We throw out the book, and people should. In fact, I'm going to do a whole podcast series about great books that people love. And of course, there's Vasari's The Lives of the Artists. Isn't there like part 1 and part 2? I think it's divided into 2 parts.
Well, yeah, yes. And the thing that I always lead with when I'm talking about Vasari is that he was a great storyteller, not so much a great fact checker.
No.
So that's my number one thing. Great stories, not great facts. And he waited to publish at least the first edition of The Lives of the Artists. He waited to publish it until Michelangelo died. He wrote it in the 1550s before Michelangelo died. And then he waited until after he died to publish it because Michelangelo wasn't so keen on it. Yeah.
That's right, because he was his firsthand witness. But he's kind of what many consider the first. Giorgio Vasari is considered the first art historian, but probably he would want to be known as a great painter. Yeah. But sometimes his paintings, his frescoes, he did a beautiful job in the Duomo, right? He did the frescoes in the Duomo.
Yeah, he started, and then they were finished by Federico Zuccheri a long time afterwards, in the end of the 1500s. But he did the design for the largest fresco cycle in the world. So that's not a small feat. And Vasari, I mean, this is a topic for another day, but he is, I would say, very much underappreciated painter. And I think that things are starting to change. I think we're starting to get a little bit more gentle and kind with how we speak about his artworks in general.
No, yeah, it's true. No, but I mean, just to get on to that story and the jump on with Michelangelo, because I also think many people do not know that Michelangelo was a prolific letter writer. He wrote back and forth to people all the time. So we have these stories, and he was I mean, yes, we know him as this great genius, but he was, I guess, a couple of adjectives. He had this biting sense of humor, I think. He could really, read you to filth, as drag queens would say, RuPaul's Drag Race. He said to Giorgio Vasari, because Giorgio Vasari has this famous fresco psycho in the Palazzo della Cancelleria in Rome. And he said, I did this in 100 days. And, of course, Michelangelo said, e si vede. It looks it.
Yeah, you can tell. You can tell.
Yeah, you can tell.
And that's the thing. I'm glad that you brought up Michelangelo and his writings, because this is the other thing that I always say with Michelangelo. He wanted us to remember him a certain way. Okay, there's a reason why these writings are left, these things we don't know about him. He kind of picked and chose the stories that he wanted to be remembered by, the letters that he wanted to be remembered. And really the icing on the cake with that, of course, is his biography that he had a very, very large amount of control over, written by Ascanio Condivi in 1553, 55. About 10 years before he died. But I mean, we remember him very much how he wanted us to remember him. And that's no small feat. For us today, it's not a very foreign concept, right? We curate our images online. He curated his own memory. So we always have to remember that. But in my head, I mean, I've done a significant amount of research. I've read a lot from Michelangelo. And in my head, even as a 24, 26-year-old kid, essentially, he has the voice of a grumpy old man.
No.
That's like, in my head, he's got this grumpy old man voice. Like, get out of the way. I can do it. I'll just do it myself.
Exactly. And that's more or less what he did. But it was kind of amazing, too. And funny that you say that, because he's a grumpy old man. Because when I was doing my virtual tour for St. Peter's Basilica, of course, I had to do a huge part about it with Michelangelo. I could not, and I spoke about the Pietà first, I could not find a young portrait of Michelangelo.
Right.
It's usually from his 40s. And for you guys who don't know, Michelangelo lived, he was born in 1475 and he died in 1564, almost 89
About
years.
10 days or so short of his 89th birthday.
Yes.
Twice the average man's lifespan at that point in time.
Yes, this is true. People are always amazed at that, but I always try to kind of say, okay, guys, when you say the average lifespan, there were people who lived for a long time. I would say Livia lived till she was 80, Bernini lived till he was 82, but a lot of people did die, but the average lifespan was based also on infant deaths.
Right, of course.
A lot, and also mothers.
Quite a bit, yeah.
Yeah, mothers died a lot in giving childbirth, but absolutely. Think about that. It's kind of interesting how you point that out, because, I mean, anything that he did, he excelled at. It wasn't like he was arrogant. It was just that with his mind, it was, as people said, he was touched by God, I guess. There was something divine Michelangelo. Divine Michelangelo, right?
Yeah.
Because I remember also I was talking with Federica on my podcast with her. I asked her to interview me to talk about the St. Peter's Basilica. She brought up the point, I think she even did it in one of our Facebook walks that we now have on our YouTube channel, but she brought up the point that Michelangelo, these chief architects in St. Peter's were not just designing the church, but he was an innovator on how to manage the workers, how to make them work efficiently, how to even have like a bell to sound out that everyone would go and eat at the same time, how to make things work the most efficient way possible, which I was like, really, oh my God, so he was a team manager. Even though he was famous for not wanting to work with people, he knew that he needed that. And that's what he had to do. And he was doing it in his 80s. It's just amazing to think.
That's a really good point. And a lot of people would come back to that and say that, he spent a lot of time working with the Opera del Duomo in Florence. So basically the whole, company in charge of everything having to do with the upkeep or the new interest for the cathedral, the Duomo, Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence. And he spent a lot of time understanding how Brunelleschi, not only the architecture of how Brunelleschi obviously built the dome in Florence, which is going to have a huge impact on how Michelangelo does the dome in Rome, but how Brunelleschi managed everything, how he was moving material around, even the time of the day. And that's that you brought up the way that the bells would sound to manage the workers. I mean, it's all connected. None of these artists lived in a vacuum. They're all products of their society, products of their culture, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But Michelangelo's Michelangelo. So of course, he has to take it a step further, right?
Yeah, of course. And the fact is that he had the opportunity to have some of the best education because as a young man, well, God, not even a young man, a young boy,
a teenager.
He fell under the wing of the patriarch of Florence, Lorenzo the Magnificent. So
yes.
Michelangelo's divine, Lorenzo's magnificent.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, they called him the Magnificent, so obviously it's very magnificent. But
yes,
I mean, I'm glad that you brought that up because the Medici in the 15th century, the second half of the 15th century, especially, I mean, they are running everything in Florence. Mm-hmm. Of course, Florence is still technically, and I'm using air quotes here, technically a republic or an oligarchy, but the Medici are pulling all of the strings because they control the purses, right? They have all of the cash. But Lorenzo de' Medici, I mean, he really is the humanist of the humanist Medici. Mm-hmm. He's hosting these 15th century book clubs when they're reading in Greek, reading in Latin, discussing ancient philosophy, and importantly, discussing theology and how do you put Christian theology together with ancient philosophy. And all of this is going to have a huge impact, throughout the whole Western world. But for a young boy named Michelangelo, when supposedly Lorenzo saw him working in the Medici sculpture garden, which is a great story. In reality, there were probably some introductions happening here and not just this moment of when Lorenzo the Magnificent happened upon a 13-year-old Michelangelo sculpting a faun, as the story goes.
Yes.
But it's a great story. But, to be discovered like that, in any case, however it happened, to have this kid, his critical teenage years. I mean, think about how crucial those high school years are.
Sure.
Michelangelo essentially did, boarding school, high school, in a private school, living in the Medici palace, growing up with the Medici sons and cousins in the middle of all of this new wave of humanistic learning. I mean, being part of these 15th century book clubs, it's going to have a massive impact on him. And I always wonder, I mean, I think Michelangelo would have still, of course, been Michelangelo, but I don't think he would have been the same quality of a man that he was if it hadn't been for those few years that he lived in the Medici palace here in Florence, like a Medici, learning like a Medici and soaking everything up.
Yeah, I mean, it's also interesting, as you pointed out also, that he lived with the Medici children and cousins. And of course, two of them ended up becoming popes themselves.
Yeah.
That's all, but that whole story, I mean, there's like a whole thing we could talk about the Medici, but, Leo X and then his bastard cousin, who was then legitimized by Leo, became Pope Clement VII. I mean, we just talk about the things that they built, but I've been reading this great book called The Families Who Made Rome. I don't know if you've ever heard about it. It's really amazing. Yeah, I've actually talking with the author on Twitter, and I'm hoping to get him on the podcast.
Oh, awesome.
Eventually.
That would be very cool.
Yeah, my gosh. But just the fact of what these families could do, or the popes creating orders, giving permission for certain orders to be created. I think even Clement VII started the Capuchins, or like a certain aspect of the Capuchins. It was really these extremes from Franciscans. It's just kind of fascinating stuff, but that they are there and they're probably hanging out like in high school, like how kids are with each other, and like talk about this status. And then Michelangelo, who of course we know doesn't suffer fools for anything, then has to, kind of be under them, I guess, and Lorenzo, they said, "Oh, Michelangelo, you're wonderful. You're great. You're going to go to Florence and do some work to me." And then he says off to the side, because I just find him so hard to deal with,
Yeah. And I mean, well, the other thing that we have in Florence, of course, are the slaves, or in Italian, they call them the prisoners, the unfinished works of Michelangelo. And, in the Accademia del Galleria, as you're walking up to see the David, I always speak about those first because they give you great insight into, even though they post-date or after the David, but they give you great insight into how the brain of Michelangelo worked and how he processed and how he physically sculpted these sculptures. But, everybody, well, why didn't he just finish them? Because this Pope says, do this, you do it.
Yep.
If the Pope says jump, you say how high. And he wrote about, he has letters where he complains about not having full autonomy over himself, because when the Pope says you have to do something, you have to do something. If the Pope says, leave that project, come work for me, he first left the project to start painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, goes back to the project 20 years later, and then gets called off of it again to do the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel. So he complained about the Pope.
Yes.
You can't really, the popes, I should say.
Yeah, exactly. I always say that. I mean, it's not just Michelangelo. Many artists have this issue. I mean, maybe Da Vinci was more of a super perfectionist and he would stop and start. Maybe he was easily distracted. I don't know him as well, but I got that impression from what I've read about him. But the other ones had to stop and start things. But we're talking about the slaves belong to that famous project for the tomb, the monumental tomb, as the Italians would say, of Julius II.
Yes.
That was, what is it? How many? I always think it was 80 statues or something. It was this ridiculous amount. It was going to be his job set. I think
it was going to be 40 larger than life-size sculptures.
My God.
And then it's what he ended up sculpting the Moses for that, which is obviously a much reduced scale. It was supposed to go inside New St. Peter's, but in a much reduced scale in St. Peter.
In chains.
Thank you.
Yes. I just
right by the Colosseum in Rome.
Yeah, it is. It's very reduced, but
but it's still spectacular. And the Moses is, he's amazing.
Yeah, the Moses is amazing. And, I've read recently, because after the restorations, it's funny, I think there's Leah and Rachel on either side that are not that great. And some books say that he had a big hand in those, which I don't think he did. But now unfinished is Julius II, who's reclining up on the top, very much like a river god. And they're thinking now more that maybe he had done a lot of
quite a bit about it. Yeah.
The face. And then you see the body, which is these wonderful things of getting to see his unfinished work. That's also so interesting for me, is okay, so we know that he is sculpting these things in Rome. When we talk about pieces, we talk about the artists, we talk about the history, what happened to these pieces. It's okay, so the unfinished slaves, how did they end up in Florence? And then, of course, the finished slaves, there are two of them that are in the Louvre. And this whole history about what happens to the pieces.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah, the afterlife of the pieces, almost, as if to say. The slaves end up in Florence because of the Medici dukes.
Sure.
Of course. I can't remember off the top of my head who was the collector that bought them up. So essentially after Michelangelo died, right, of course he dies in Rome, but the Florentines are no, the Florentines are we know that you wanted to be buried in Rome, but we're going to take you back to Florence.
That's right. They steal his body.
They steal his body and bring him back to Florence, where he's buried in Santa Croce here in Florence. But there's another piece of the story, the life of Michelangelo, the afterlife of Michelangelo, that I think a lot of people tend to forget, is that when he died, he had amassed a massive fortune.
Yes.
He had a huge fortune. And I think because of maybe because of pop culture, When the Agony and the Ecstasy, the book, and then the movie that was made, and maybe some of the portraits, or maybe some of the accounts, especially by Condivi, of how Michelangelo worked. And, he always wore the same clothes, would wear the same clothes for days, would go in these work fits where he would work for 72 hours straight and then pass out covered in marble grit. And there's that famous line about how his boots...
Oh, yes. So he had them on for 4 months, and when he took them off, they peeled off his skin. Oof.
Yeah. Okay. So we have this image of Michelangelo as this kind of crazy genius artist, but also kind of fits how in our minds what we think of the starving artist with the long shaggy hair, the beard, the dirty clothes, right? But he wasn't at all a starving artist. So when he died, his nephew, most of the money went to his nephew. He left him quite a lot of money and quite a lot of works that were still kind of under his ownership were sold off, finished or unfinished, which just, of course, added to, the Buonarroti family bank account. And then, of course, Michelangelo had bought a large plot of land here by Santa Croce, and then his nephew started to build a huge, beautiful 16th century palazzo, which is today the Casa Buonarroti Museum. So all that to say, he was famous enough during his lifetime, and then right after he died, that there was kind of this frenzy to buy up some of these unfinished pieces that were left in his workshop. The slaves being something, and I can't remember who it was right off the bat. I would have to look it up, who got them. But essentially, the Medici dukes, once they become dukes, in the beginning of the 17th century, they're in the Medici villa in Rome, and then get transported to the Pitti Palace, where they end up in the Boboli Gardens in the Grotto of Buontalenti.
Oh, that's right. Okay.
Yeah, which is filled with artificial stalactites and stalagmites coming up and out of the ground. And so the unfinished slaves kind of came out of the corners of this grotto, and it worked. It definitely worked very well until end of the 19th century. They moved into the Accademia.
Oh gosh, so it was the end of the 19th century. Yeah. So there was no photographs of that, I think, or maybe there must be a print of it. Maybe that would be
no. They're end of the 19th century. There are prints of what it looked like in the.
Oh gosh, yes.
Yeah, and they've put copies in there for today, so you go and you get an idea of what they look like.
Oh, great. So,
grotto, yeah.
Well, I'm going to look that up because, of course, another thing, when I will have time, I love to, because we are videotaping these, we'll be putting these up on our YouTube channel, and I love to insert images of the people that we're talking about and the places and the things. I think it adds on a whole new level to the storytelling because that's definitely what we do. It's very interesting to think about that. Now, to talk about his family, if I recall, and I'm wondering, okay, so he must have had some faith in his nephew. He was constantly complaining about his family, that they were a bunch of spongers.
One brother yes.
Yeah. And so were they bad with the money? I mean, what's happened? The family no longer exists. I mean, if he had that enormous amount of money, what did the nephew do with it? He sold off the artwork. Maybe he should have held on to that artwork for a little longer.
Actually, I mean, I should say he did. His nephew was the one who started to build the palazzo, the family home, which is the Casa Buonarroti today. And then his, I want to say, great nephew, I can't remember if it's one generation or two generations afterwards. He is in the beginning of the 1600s. I mean, he's basically decorating the palazzo. He's the one that calls in, famous artists like Artemisia Gentileschi, who's in Florence at that point in time, and she paints a couple of frescoes inside the family chapel in there. No, he is buying up, especially earlier pieces of Michelangelo. He's trying to get. So we have the Madonna of the Stairs is there, which is a beautiful, beautiful a relief sculpture. It's so beautiful. The Madonna holding baby Jesus. There's another little boy climbing up on the stairs. This was done when Michelangelo was a teenager, probably during his time working for the Medici, right? It's gorgeous. It's such a beautiful piece. The Battle of the Centaurs is there. They so many drawings and sketches. It's honestly, the Casa Buonarroti is a gem, a hidden gem here in Florence. And I will never understand why it's not overflowing with people every single day, because it should be. It really is an incredible space.
Well, that's great that it isn't, but you're right, it should be. But, honestly, can I dare say I have never been to the museum. So
okay, well, next time you're here, we need to go. We need
to go. Well, we will be going up to film our TE Destination series up in Florence, which I'm very excited to do. And so maybe I will drag Dylan along, and then we're going to go to the Museo Buonarroti.
I'll drag you guys along.
Okay. Yeah, he'll go. If you're going, he'll say, okay, I'll go.
Okay.
He adores you. Now, talking about something else that's very risque. Okay. What is your take on the presumed homosexuality of Michelangelo? Or it's not something I talk about on tours because I don't want to ruffle feathers necessarily. People ask, I bring it up. But what is your take on it? Do you think it's true, or this is, someone's opinion on it, or what?
Well, first of all, I think it's hard to use the same terminology and the same words and concepts that we use today.
Sure.
Because it was, relatively normal. It was relatively normal. And I mean, sodomy is what they would have called it back then, right? That you've got those reports, or these reports of the what am I trying to say? Well, there's, for example, there's the famous case with Leonardo, right? Where there was this basically anonymous box where you could, on town hall, where you could send in a letter writing, I witnessed Michelangelo, or I witnessed Leonardo with the young boy, blah, 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 blah. Oh. And so we have, famous cases where these accusations have been made, but all this to say, I mean, it was a much it was a normal thing. It was a
Sure.
normal thing. It wasn't such a shocking or not to say that. I mean, it was a little bit more normalized than we think of it today. And
Well, sure.
I mean, no, what we think of how the past was back then.
No, well, we put on our
Yeah.
own context
Yeah,
of our
exactly.
time.
Yes.
You know,
Our goggles of today looking backwards, especially because we have, some of these documents left that make it seem like it was such a big deal back then, but in reality, it wasn't.
Well, no, of
So all of
course.
this to say, it fits. It fits.
Sure.
And it's very, very clear that Michelangelo had, more than an appreciation for the male body.
Yeah.
I mean, an obsession, really. So I don't know. I don't
Look
know.
at the
And
work.
of course,
Well, for
these
me,
are things we'll never know. But in my own head, I think yes.
no, okay, interesting. No, I mean, it's interesting when you're saying about that because, of course, I'm even thinking back. I don't even remember when sodomy was illegal. The act of sodomy was illegal in Victorian times, I would imagine, because it was very much so in England.
Right.
We have Oscar Wilde being arrested for this accusation. Yeah. And probably back in those times, it wasn't that. And a lot of it did go around, especially probably during the Renaissance when they're saying new ideas and going back to the thought of the ancients. Even the ancients themselves had different ideas about it than we do today.
Exactly.
And also people like Da Vinci and Michelangelo had very powerful people behind them and protecting them.
Right. That had their backs.
Yeah. I mean, for me, clearly, if you look at his work, he can do some very beautiful women, but when he does naked women, it's clear that he's never, even though supposedly he's done autopsies, it seems to me he's never seen a naked woman before because he draws breasts that look like breasts do when they're in their dresses with, being held up. So,
well, okay, that's another interesting thing. I was going to answer, I had another point, but the first part of your comment there, okay, I can't remember. I'll have to come back to it. I'll have to come back to mom brain. We'll chalk it up to mom brain. In the Uffizi, I talk about this, especially when I'm in the Uffizi, standing in front of Michelangelo's Tondo Doni, the only mobile painting that we know of for sure by Michelangelo today. Of course, the rest being attached to the Sistine Chapel. And the Virgin Mary there, I always say she's got like these Michelle Obama arms. She's got these super strong arms. And when I'm teaching Michelangelo's painting style, we always kind of compare. Michelangelo has a more sculptural painting style compared to Leonardo that has a much more painterly painting style.
Sure.
And what I mean by that is Michelangelo paints figures that look like marble statues, right? It kind of looks often like the skin has that gleam of marble statues. Anyways, I talk about this in terms of the Madonna there in the Tondo Doni and how strong she is. And here's another thing, Michelangelo, okay, there must be some kernel of truth in that he had, many opportunities to study male cadavers and had fewer opportunities to study female cadavers just because that's what was available to him, right? He definitely studied some, but we don't know how many but he definitely did get some study in there. But he also wrote about this idea of the soul in the body. And he believed that, all matter houses a little piece of God. So whether that's a block of marble or whether that's a human body, it houses a piece of God, which is basically what your soul is, right? And what we think of today is we think of, the exterior doesn't count. It's what's on the inside that matters. But for him, it was the opposite. Your exterior, your appearance, was a reflection of the morality of your soul on the interior. Okay, so you had to be strong and you had to be beautiful because that meant that you were strong enough to fight off that temptation of sin. And I mean, the Virgin Mary, she is the Virgin Mary, right? She is the most virtuous and pure of all. So she has to be extremely strong and powerful and extremely beautiful. And then everybody else always says, well, what about the Sistine Chapel, all those figures? Well, of course, we know Michelangelo's style moves into this very super muscular, all of his figures change from the David being quite slim. And yes, David works out, but it doesn't look like he takes steroids to we get to his later works, especially on the Last Judgment scene on the altar wall, in which the figures just get super buff, right? But all of those figures, they are there. And I'm thinking, especially actually back in the Sistine Chapel ceiling, the Sibyls. If you look at the powerhouses of women that are the Sibyls, it fits. It fits with this description of they are absolutely virtuous, pure women fighting off temptation, fighting off evil. So there's something about that too. And I like to bring that into the conversation because he wrote about it. He talked about it. So
that's really interesting. So many things that you bring up. That's very also Greek or kind of adaptation of the Greek, where it's like, if you're beautiful, you're good. If you're ugly, you're evil.
Well, and this is what he's studying. This is what he's studying as a teenager with the Medici family. Yeah,
of course. And maybe it seems like almost like his thought process with it is more like, if you led a debaucherous lifestyle and were drinking a lot or eating excessively, then you became ugly, and that reflected maybe your soul.
Yeah.
But, that's how we started our talk, was about the soul of his soul in the work. Oh gosh, it makes me think of that terribly beautiful but depressing film. Have you ever heard the movie with Naomi Watts called 21 Grams? I think Sean.
I've never seen it. I know what you're talking about, but I've never seen it.
Well, apparently somewhere the movie's based on the fact is that when we die, we lose 21 grams of weight. And that is this concept of like a piece of soul. And, when I've seen loved ones have passed away, I do feel like their soul is no longer with them. Oh wow. That's very interesting. Very interesting. Oh my goodness. Can
I take us back to the Greeks here for a second?
Sure, please do.
All right. So the other thing, and back to David, I know we're jumping around a lot, but back to David, everybody always says, okay, well, David, when we're talking about David, of course, the backstory, we're talking about David and Goliath. David was supposed to be this kind of 13-year-old kid, shepherd boy. Michelangelo's version of the story is not a 13-year-old kid. No. He's like a 25-year-old man, a dude at the apex of his masculinity, right? But everybody always asked me, would he have been fighting against the giant Goliath totally, completely nude? No. Probably not, right? The story goes that, King Saul offered his armor to young David. And in my mind, this is where I think Saul must have felt just a little bit guilty in letting this teenage boy go against Goliath, which was almost to his certain death. You're thinking this kid's not going to survive, but he's just a shepherd boy. If we lose him, not a big deal. So he was offered the armor, of course, went without the armor because it didn't fit. He was just a kid. It didn't fit him. But did he go buck naked like this? Probably not. But the thing is, okay, people always ask me the naked bodies and the Renaissance, the sculpture, the paintings, naked. Okay, yes. The short answer, of course, is that you have this appreciation for the human body. We're talking about a much more anthropocentric society versus the theocentric society of the Middle Ages. So the theocentric, of course, God at the center of everything. In the 15th century, in the Renaissance, humanism, humans at the center of everything, anthropocentric. So we're celebrating the human body, especially the ideal, perfect human body. But I always take it, a step further. And I think Michelangelo, had an idea of this. In the Greeks, if you read so many Greek plays, so many Greek, if you read anything, almost always at the heart of it is this discussion of free will. Are we free, or do the gods control everything? And so if you're just a human living on Earth, you're immortal in a world controlled by immortals. The only thing that you can actually end up controlling is your own physical body. Right? So to achieve this perfection in the physicality of your body, is my fate already decided for me? Do I already know? They already have control over that, so I'm going to have control over my body. So to have this idealized body means that you worked so hard, but more than that, you controlled it in a world that is controlled by immortals. One of the few things that mortals could actually control. And so there's more to that than just the celebration of these ideal bodies. It's the celebration of that accomplishment of man or woman, right? The idealized body of the woman would be like, we call it the Venus pudica
Yeah. Oh.
Feigned modesty.
She's strong in her beauty, but she's also humble and protects
Yeah.
herself.
Yeah.
That's kind of amazing. I love how you have this very specific point of view that works through it. There's this thought that I was told that I found interesting. And you take it up to another level, but a lot, and that he was influenced by the Greeks, but that the fact is that the Greek heroes, or Roman statues of Greek heroes and of the gods, are naked.
Yeah.
But that meant that in ancient times everyone was gallivanting naked around.
Right.
That wasn't the truth at all.
Although the athletes were.
Well, maybe, yeah, I guess so. But I guess the point is that they were, to be different from regular people.
Yeah, that's
that they did not need clothes. They
elevated
were
above regular
elevated
people.
Above godlike. That's also amazing. And don't think, Michelle, but I mean, this takes it, but it still has a strong reaction today. I mean, you see all these people who are great influencers, but I mean, it's like, for me, of course, because I'm a gay man and I look at Instagram, and of course, all these like gods pop up, and I'm like, how is it that they have these perfect bodies? But it's still, I mean, it doesn't take of the divine, because of course, Michelangelo is in what we use the word divine, and the David is divine, but these figures are influencers. They're given this name. I mean, this is the modern context of it, but they dedicate themselves to these bodies, and it has this like impression on people. Mm-hmm. They are attracted to it. They have like over 100,000, 200,000 people following them. And it's just, I don't know. I think, oh my God, they just dedicate themselves to these bodies. But, and his statue, it's a lot of work. A lot of work and a lot of sacrifice too, because they don't have fun food like cornetti in the morning with your cappuccino by any means. But I mean, but you always have to imagine, I think the male youth body is based on the ideal, the aesthetic is Michelangelo's body, of the David, I mean, I don't think anything goes beyond that. If you look at that is the perfection that people strive for, I would imagine.
Yeah. 500 years later.
500 years later. I mean,
be clear, 500 years later. Yeah.
Yep, that's true. That's a great point. I mean, it does. It's such a beautiful contemplative statue. And it's also very interesting because he obviously had seen Donatello's David beforehand. Now, Donatello's David is a 13-year-old naked boy, who's about to...
His second David, his bronze David. Yes, as I call him, the sassy David. We're talking about sassy David. Yeah, who's got his hand on his hip. Like,
yes. So tell me about the first David. I don't remember the first David by Donatello.
Well, the first David actually connects to Michelangelo's David because it was a similar commission. 1408. So Michelangelo's David ends up in front of Town Hall, in front of Palazzo Vecchio, City Hall, Town Hall. Mm-hmm. But that was not... Got it.
Okay, guys, we got kicked out for a moment on Zoom, which happens. But if I remember correctly, Emily, we were talking about how you were pointing out that the David by Donatello, he had two versions. And I was referring to the sassy David, as you like to call him. So you're going to tell me about the one that was more influential for Michelangelo.
Well, at least that for more influential for the birth of Michelangelo's David, because his Donatello's David of 1408 was actually, I was talking about the commission of Michelangelo's David. This is where I was talking about the commission of Michelangelo's David was not for Town Hall. It was made to go up on one of we call it a spur at the end of the Cathedral of Florence has 3 supporting domes or tribunes. And on each of those 3 tribunes, there are 4 buttresses that finish in what look like sculptural pedestals. We call them spurs. And the original plan was to have 12 sculptures adorning the cathedral about 85, 90 feet up in the air, the level of the terrace, just above the terraces that you could do, which is a great walk today to do the terraces of the cathedral. So anyways, Michelangelo's David, I mean, he works on it 1504 to 1501 to 1504, but Donatello had been working already in the beginning on this same project in 1408, which was the conception of this idea of the 12 Old Testament prophets to basically sit as, to adorn like jewels on the crown of the cathedral. And so Donatello's David was if I'm not mistaken, the second sculpture to be created out of the 12. Because Nanni di Banco and his father sculpted another one, again, about the same time, 1408. But ultimately, they don't go up on top of the cathedral because they're too small. They're too small. So that's how they figure out the scale, the life size scale of these marble sculptures was too small. You could hardly see them from up high. And so Donatello's early David, which is kind of a hangover, it's not completely, it's a very early Donatello, right? It's got a little bit of that curve left from the Gothic style. He's got, I call it glazed donut eyes, where there's not really much happening behind the eyes yet. That psychological component is a little bit missing there.
Think of Homer Simpson when you say glazed donut.
Oh, sorry. Don't put those two together. But well, you know what I mean. That psychological component's not quite there yet, but it will be soon. But anyways, that goes to town hall. That David, the signoria, so the rulers of the city, step in and say, we like this, we want it. And it gets moved into the main kind of government hall, the government space inside Palazzo Vecchio, which at the time was called Palazzo della Signoria, where all of the decision-making for Florence was taking place. So anyways, that's an important work of art, obviously, because it's a major comparison, but also it's one of the first Davids that is going to be a symbol of the Republican government of Florence, which of course Michelangelo's David being planted right in front of town hall and meant as an obvious, it really was meant as an offense to the Medici family, as a threat, we can say, to the Medici family, who at the time, I'm skipping around a whole bunch here, but at the time that Michelangelo was working on this, again, 1501 to 1504, the Medici family had been exiled from the city of Florence. They were living in Rome. So by placing David south, facing the River Arno, but facing Rome, David takes on the meaning of being, of course, the Florentine government. And so therefore Goliath is then intended as the Medici family.
Nah.
So the message is quite clear. And this is why people always tell me, well, we started off the podcast with this. You were talking about, you had a young woman who said, well, do I have to go and see the original? You have to see both. In my opinion, you have to make sure that you go and see the original because it's so spectacular to get up close and look at all the details. But you have to know and you have to see and really understand the political context behind where the original stood in Piazza della Signoria, where today there's the copy, an exact copy, of course, because it was so insanely politically charged. That was not how Michelangelo conceived the project, but that's how it ended up being. And people always say, well, how do we know that? You're reading into it. How do you know that it was intended as a threat to the Medici family? In this case, we have the minutes written down from the meeting in 1504.
Wow.
In which they discussed where to put him. And they ended up with two possible locations: where it is in front of the main door of Palazzo della Signoria, Palazzo Vecchio today, or underneath the Loggia dei Lanzi. So right, if you're looking at Palazzo Vecchio, looking at the tower, it's to your immediate right there. Where today you've got beautiful sculptures, the Cellini, but everything. So it was meant to go, the second faction, or the other, I should say, option was to put him underneath there. And that option was being pushed by the pro-Medici political faction. But ultimately, of course, the anti-Medici faction won out there. So all this to say, David, it goes back to Donatello. Michelangelo, we know, spent a lot of time studying Donatello and his works, especially the St. George. That's another one to bring up whenever you're talking about Michelangelo's David. But again, none of these artists live in a vacuum. They're all connected through the threads of history.
Of course. It's kind of interesting. Just one more question, though, is that how was the relationship with the Medici and Michelangelo after he finished the David? Did he get the blame, or he's like, well, that's what the people wanted of Florence. I didn't have anything to say about it.
Well, it's a good thing to bring up. And like we already mentioned, Michelangelo had grown up with the Medici sons and cousins. So, and he's going to continue to work for them, especially as we were talking before when they become popes. So he's got this relationship with them that's sure rocky at times, but it's still at least a professional relationship set up that holds over for a very long time. But I think it's more about the fact of how Michelangelo's David was so well received that nobody could negate the importance, the artistic importance of that work of art. And the Medici, they can't do anything to it. I mean, they are already, when they become, in 1529 to 1530, Pope Clement VII takes the papal army, besieges the city of Florence, blah, 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 blah. And essentially the Medici take over the city, become dukes of the city in the 1530s, right? So the Medici do come back and take over. They can't do anything. They can't touch the David. They're already having to navigate a takeover of a city that does not want to be run by one family, one guy, right? Yeah. You're navigating rebellion. And when Cosimo, Duke Cosimo I, he's going to become the very first Grand Duke, but when he becomes Duke in 1537, at the age of 17, by the way, one of the very first things that he did was to publicly execute in Piazza della Signoria, publicly executed, people who were plotting against him. So they're juggling how to run this new duchy. And one of the things that you really can't touch, you really can't do anything about, is Michelangelo's David. Again, it was just so famous right from its conception that they can't take it down. They can't move it. But what they do, they put up, the very first Duke before Cosimo, he puts up this huge Hercules, by Baccio Bandinelli, as this counterpiece to the David. And if we're thinking about all the sculptures in Piazza della Signoria as power symbols of the regime that placed them there, Baccio Bandinelli's Hercules is quite clear. He's holding onto a giant bronze bat, and he's about to bash the daylights out of the guy whose head he's holding onto by the hair, right? Don't mess with me. It's it's just brute force. Of course. So, and then of course, Cosimo and the rest of the Medici dukes put quite a few other important sculptures in the piazza that reinforce their political agenda, their propaganda. One of the most famous and most beautiful being Cellini's Perseus, holding up the severed head of Medusa, which, supposedly in Cellini's biography, he writes that he kind of tricked Cosimo into commissioning it because he showed Cosimo the sculpture on a small scale, like a very small miniature. And Cosimo said, "Oh, I want that full scale, and I want it right here in Piazza della Signoria so that everybody can see it and understand." Wow. Right?
That's amazing, Emily. Wow, this is such you've given us a lot to chew and contemplate. And I'm very much looking forward to coming back to Florence and being able to look at these in that Piazza della Signoria or Palazzo Vecchio with a whole new light, with the context of these statues being placed out, because one gets overwhelmed. I love Florence. It's a beautiful place, but, listening to people like you really shows us how special it truly is.
It's a very special place. Yeah,
it is. It is unique and it is special.
Yeah.
So is Rome, but
thank you. Oh, Rome. There's no. I hate when people make these comparisons because it's a different. It's
apples and oranges, right? Yeah. It's completely different. Yeah.
But thank you for having me. I know we've jumped around quite a bit today, but that's the beauty of these podcasts, is that it's more of a conversation, and I love that. It's fun for me to not have to follow along the exact
through line.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I will definitely be asking you back. We will talk about many other things. I think I'm going to be asking all the guides about any particular figure. Well, we spoke about Michelangelo today, but if there's other things you want to talk about, because I want to talk about famous figures in history, because some of our podcasts that we've gotten the most attention, was Julius Caesar was the most, when we get the most downloads. When I talked to, it was our very first podcast.
Oh, then we might need to do one on Lorenzo, on Cosimo, any of the Medici.
Exactly. There's a whole world, or the Medici family. It's just wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Anyway, thanks again, Emily, and thank you everybody else for listening in to TE Talk, sponsored by Through Eternity Tours. Please remember, if you have any questions for me or Emily, you can write to our regular office at througheternity.com. And remember to give us a 5-star rating and write a review for everyone to see, and let people know about this podcast. Thanks everybody so much. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to our TE Talks with Guides. We have a new episode every Wednesday. Please subscribe to get an alert when each podcast comes out. Rate us and tell people how you enjoyed it, and share it on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. Most importantly, If you enjoyed it, send us a feedback about the show. Also, if you are curious about what some of these people and places we talked about look like, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and watch the video on this podcast where we have inserted special images for you to further enjoy the story.